I came home at 2 in the morning to find my own master bedroom dead-bolted from the inside. But the real shock was not my daughter-in-law standing there in my expensive silk robe. It was the arrogant smirk on her face when she told me to go sleep on the guest couch because she owned my house now. Little did she know she had just handed me the absolute perfect opportunity for her ruin. I am Yvonne, a 62-year-old retired hospital administrator. For 15 years since my husband passed away, I worked double shifts, pouring my blood, sweat and tears into paying off my beautiful 4-bedroom home in an upscale Atlanta suburb. I gave everything to make sure my only son, Jamal, graduated debt-free and had a solid start in life. But all that sacrifice meant nothing when I returned exhausted that night from visiting my sick sister. I climbed the stairs and put my key into my door, only to find it locked from the inside. I knocked confused until the door finally cracked open. Chloe, my son's wife, stood there wrapped in my custom silk robe. She blocked the entrance with a smug grin, looking me right in the eye. She whispered that they were taking the master bedroom from now on, and that I could sleep on the lumpy couch downstairs. After all, she said, it is our house now. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I just stared at her and smiled a cold, calculated smile, knowing the trap had just been set. Losing my husband 15 years ago was a pain so profound it threatened to swallow me whole. But as a black mother with a son looking up to her, I simply did not have the luxury of falling apart. I dried my tears, put on my scrubs, and marched into the hospital day after day. As a hospital administrator, I took every extra shift, every holiday rotation, and every on-call hour I could physically manage. I ran my body into the ground for 2 reasons. First, I was determined to pay off the beautiful 4-bedroom brick home my husband and I had purchased in an upscale Atlanta suburb. That house was our dream, realized a symbol of our hard work, and I refused to let the bank take it. Second, I wanted to ensure that my only son, Jamal, stepped into the world without the suffocating weight of student loans dragging him down. I poured every dime of my life savings, every bonus, and every tax refund into his college education. When he walked across that stage to receive his degree completely debt-free, my chest swelled with a pride so fierce it brought me to my knees. I honestly believed my heavy lifting was done. I thought I had raised a responsible, honorable man who understood the value of sacrifice. 2 years ago, Jamal married Chloe. I welcomed her into the family with wide open arms and a hopeful heart. But shortly after their wedding, they sat me down at my own dining table with distressed looks on their faces. Jamal did the talking, explaining how brutal the economy was, how the housing market was impossible to crack, and how their rent was eating up every paycheck. They looked at me with pleading eyes and asked for a favor. They only needed 6 months, they promised. Just 6 months of living with me rent-free so they could save up a solid down payment for a house of their own. Acting out of pure maternal love, I did not hesitate. I cleared out my sewing room, made space in my garage, and welcomed them into my home. I told them to keep their money, build their foundation, and prepare for their future. But 6 months came and went like a fleeting breeze. Then a year passed, and suddenly we were crossing the 2-year mark. The massive savings account they kept promising to build was nothing but a convenient myth. Instead of house hunting, I watched a daily parade of delivery boxes pile up on my front porch. Chloe was constantly coming home with designer shopping bags and expensive iced coffees, while Jamal somehow found the money to upgrade his gaming consoles, his car accessories, and his wardrobe. Not once did they offer a dime toward the household. The entire financial weight of keeping the home running fell squarely onto my retired shoulders. I paid the steep county property taxes out of my savings. I covered the skyrocketing utility bills caused by Chloe leaving the air conditioning blasting all day. I was the one navigating the grocery store aisles, spending my fixed income to fill a refrigerator and pantry, that they would empty without a single word of gratitude. Slowly, the home that had been my peaceful sanctuary morphed into an agonizing prison of tension. I found myself walking on eggshells, tiptoeing down my own hardwood hallways, so I would not disturb Chloe when she decided to sleep in until noon. I stopped hosting my church sisters for our traditional Sunday dinners because Chloe complained that we laughed too loud and disturbed her peace. I bit my tongue until it bled when I found my expensive skincare products emptied and left carelessly on the bathroom counter. I swallowed my dignity when I struggled to carry heavy bags of soil for my garden, while Jamal walked right past me, his eyes glued to his smartphone, completely ignoring the mother who had broken her back to give him a privileged life. I endured all of it because I loved my son. I kept convincing myself that it was just a phase, that if I just kept the peace, Jamal would eventually wake up and be the man I raised. I made endless excuses for their blatant disrespect, believing that family was worth the discomfort. I loved him so deeply that I completely blinded myself to the harsh reality standing right in my own kitchen. I was eagerly funding their life of luxury, exhausting my hard-earned retirement, while they looked right through me. I thought I was giving them a stepping stone, but to them, my generosity was nothing more than weakness. I refused to see that the son I had sacrificed everything for was happily watching me drain myself dry, completely content to let me carry his burdens, while he and his wife quietly plotted to take the very roof from over my head. The disrespect did not start with a loud argument. It crept in like a slow poison. First, it was my kitchen cabinets being rearranged without my permission. Then it was the thermostat being lowered until my bones ached from the cold. But the true turning point happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I came down the stairs and noticed the hallway felt remarkably bare. The gallery wall, where I had lovingly hung generations of our family history, was stripped completely naked. Photos of my late husband, pictures of Jamal as a little boy, and cherished portraits of my grandparents were gone. I found Chloe in the kitchen sipping a sparkling water. When I asked her where my family photos were, she did not even have the decency to look guilty. She simply waved her hand toward the garage and said she threw them in a box because they were tacky and outdated. She claimed the house needed a more modern and minimalist aesthetic. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I looked to Jamal, who was sitting right there at the island eating a sandwich. I waited for my son to stand up and demand his wife respect our family legacy. Instead, he stared down at his plate and mumbled that Chloe just had an eye for interior design and I should let her decorate. I swallowed the lump of absolute betrayal in my throat and walked out to the garage to rescue my memories from the trash. If I thought the erased photographs were the climax of her audacity, I was sorely mistaken. 2 weeks later, I returned from my morning walk to find a beat-up truck parked in my driveway. I walked into my living room and found a strange man with his muddy boots propped up on my expensive mahogany coffee table. It was Chloe's older brother, Brad. He was a man well into his 30s who had never held a steady job in his life. Chloe waltzed down the stairs and casually announced that Brad had lost his apartment and would be staying in the guest room for a while. She did not ask. She dictated. This was my home, purchased with decades of my blood and sweat at the hospital, and my daughter-in-law was treating it like a free motel for her entitled relatives. I immediately pulled Jamal into the kitchen and demanded answers. I expected him to finally draw a line, but my son, the boy I had moved heaven and earth for, simply rubbed the back of his neck and refused to meet my eyes. He told me it was just temporary and begged me not to make a big deal out of it because Chloe was easily stressed. He defended a lazy interloper over his own mother's peace of mind. Brad moved in and immediately acted as if he were the lord of the manor. The guest room, which I had kept immaculate for visiting church friends, quickly smelled of stale beer and unwashed laundry. He slept until noon and spent his days lounging on my sofa, leaving greasy fingerprints on my remotes and crumbs across my rugs. The financial strain doubled overnight. I would go to the grocery store and spend my pension on premium salmon, organic vegetables, and fresh fruit, only to wake up and find Brad had devoured it all in the middle of the night. He never offered a dime. He never offered a simple thank you. He just consumed everything in his path and left a trail of sticky dishes in my sink for me to clean. When I politely asked him to wash his own plates, he scoffed and muttered that a woman my age should enjoy having something to do to keep busy. The final shred of my patience disintegrated during a Sunday afternoon. I was in the kitchen preparing a roast, quietly enduring their presence in the adjacent living room. Brad was complaining loudly about the volume of my gospel music playing from the kitchen radio. I heard him tell Chloe that the house was too big for one tired old lady anyway. He laughed a sharp, grating sound and said it was probably time they started looking into state-run nursing homes before I completely lost my mind and became a real burden. Chloe actually giggled. She agreed with him, adding that my traditional ways were suffocating their lifestyle. I froze my hands, trembling as I held a kitchen knife. I waited for the booming voice of my son to defend my honor. I waited for Jamal to throw Brad out the front door for disrespecting the woman who gave him life. But only silence followed. Jamal sat there and allowed another man to discuss tossing his mother away like expired milk. In that suffocating silence, my sorrow evaporated. The pain of my son's cowardice was instantly replaced by a brilliant, blazing clarity. I realized right then that crying would not save me, only action would. I started noticing the little anomalies first. As a retired hospital administrator, my entire life had been governed by strict schedules, meticulous records, and immaculate filing systems. I oversaw budgets worth millions of dollars and managed hundreds of staff members. I knew exactly when my property tax notices were supposed to arrive. I knew the exact day of the month my bank statements and investment portfolios would appear in my brass mailbox at the end of the driveway. But suddenly the mail was remarkably light. Important envelopes were completely missing from the daily stack. I would ask Chloe if she had brought the mail in, and she would simply shrug, barely glancing up from her glossy magazine, claiming the postal worker must be running late or making mistakes. But the missing documents were entirely too specific. Junk mail, utility bills, and her expensive clothing catalogues found their way to the kitchen counter just fine. My financial footprints, however, were vanishing into thin air. The uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach solidified into cold, hard fact on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I had returned home early from visiting a friend. The house was quiet. Far too quiet for a weekday, with Brad supposedly living in the guest room. I slipped off my shoes to avoid tracking moisture onto the hardwood floors and walked softly down the hallway. As I passed my home office, a room that was strictly off-limits to everyone, I saw the heavy oak door slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and my blood ran absolutely cold. I found Brad standing behind my desk. He had his hands buried deep inside my bottom filing drawer, aggressively shuffling through my personal folders. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs, but I forced my voice to remain perfectly steady. I asked him exactly what he thought he was doing in my private office. Brad did not even have the grace to look embarrassed. He slowly pulled his hands out of my drawer, leaned back against my vintage desk, and crossed his arms with a smug, arrogant grin. He chuckled a condescending sound that made my hands curl into fists and told me he was just looking for a pen. A pen. He was digging through my tax returns and confidential bank statements, claiming he needed to jot down a quick note for a brilliant new startup idea he had just thought of. He then looked me up and down and had the absolute audacity to tell me that I should really clear out some of that old junk. He smiled maliciously and said, "A woman my age had no business hoarding so much confusing paperwork," adding that all this financial stress was probably bad for my aging heart. The sheer disrespect was a physical blow. But my son was nowhere to be found, and I knew arguing with a self-serving fool would yield absolutely nothing. I simply pointed to the door and asked him to step out of my office immediately. Once I was alone, I sat in my leather chair and took a deep, stabilizing breath. 40 years of managing massive hospital departments, navigating cutthroat board meetings, and dealing with deceptive vendors kicked into high gear. I had not survived the ruthless world of healthcare administration by being naive or weak. My mind sharpened into a lethal instrument, the targeted missing mail, the blatant snooping in my private files, the constant insidious remarks from Brad and Chloe about my age and my ability to maintain my own home. It was not just petty disrespect anymore. It was a calculated reconnaissance mission. They were actively looking for my vulnerabilities. They were assessing my assets. I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that a sinister plot was brewing right under my own roof, and my own son was likely letting it happen. I knew exactly what I had to do. Panic is the ultimate enemy of strategy. Instead of raising hell and putting them on high alert, I decided to play right into their arrogant assumptions. That very afternoon, while they were out spending Jamal's paycheck at a fancy restaurant, I drove to the hardware store. I purchased heavy-duty locks for every single filing cabinet in my office. I spent hours transferring my most sensitive documents, deeds, and financial records into a fireproof safe, hidden deep beneath the floorboards of my closet. But outwardly, I changed my entire demeanor. If they wanted a weak, declining mother-in-law, I was going to give an award-winning performance. I began to shuffle my feet slightly when I walked into the kitchen. I started asking Jamal the same simple questions twice, watching the triumphant smirks pass between him and Chloe. I would deliberately misplace my reading glasses and wander around the living room, looking confused, muttering about how my memory just was not what it used to be. I even intentionally burned a pan of biscuits, crying out that I had completely forgotten I put them in the oven. I played the role of the tired, forgetful old lady with absolute perfection. And just as I predicted, I watched their defenses drop day by day. They became sloppy whispering just a little too loudly in the living room, leaving their own laptops open on the kitchen counter, entirely convinced that the old woman was fading away. They thought I was losing my mind, but in reality, I was quietly sharpening my axe, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was a suffocatingly warm Tuesday night, the kind of southern night where the air feels thick and heavy. I tossed and turned in my bed, unable to find even an ounce of peace. My mind kept racing over the missing mail, the suddenly locked drawers in my own home, and the arrogant smirks passing between my son and his wife. Sleep completely evaded me. Finally, I threw off my quilt and decided to go down to the kitchen for a glass of ice water to calm my frayed nerves. The house was pitch black, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the tall hallway windows. I walked softly down the hardwood stairs, relying on 40 years of knowing every single creak and groan of this house to mask my footsteps. As I approached the kitchen, I noticed the heavy glass sliding doors leading to the back patio were cracked open. The warm night breeze carried the faint, foul smell of cheap cigars and something else. Hushed voices. I paused, pressing my back flat against the cool wall of the dining room. I peered carefully around the edge of the heavy curtains. Sitting around my cast-iron patio table were Jamal, Chloe, and Brad. A single citronella candle illuminated their faces, casting long, distorted shadows across the wooden deck. They were leaning in close, huddled over a thick stack of papers. My decades of hospital administrator instincts flared to life immediately. When people whisper in the dark over documents, somebody is about to get robbed. I reached into the pocket of my robe, pulled out my smartphone, opened the voice memo application, and pressed the red record button. I held my breath and listened. Chloe was speaking first, her voice dripping with a smug, sickly sweet satisfaction. She tapped a manicured fingernail against the documents and whispered about how flawlessly the plan was coming together. She bragged about the quitclaim deed and the lease-to-own agreement sitting right there on the table. My blood turned to actual ice in my veins. A quitclaim deed. They had drafted legal documents to transfer the ownership of my sprawling four-bedroom home, the very home my late husband and I built with our own blood and sweat entirely into their names. Chloe laughed a sharp, grating sound in the quiet night and boasted about how incredibly easy it was to forge my signature. She told the men that since I was playing the forgetful old lady so perfectly lately, nobody at the county clerk office would ever question a sudden transfer of assets to her devoted son and daughter-in-law. She giggled and said I probably would not even notice I did not own the house anymore until it was far too late. I stood frozen, waiting for Jamal to object. I prayed to God that the boy I carried in my womb, the son I sacrificed my entire youth to protect and provide for, would stand up and tear those fraudulent papers to shreds. Instead, I heard his voice chime in steady and completely complicit. He told Chloe they needed to make sure the notary stamp looked authentic, confirming that once the county recorded the deed, they would have full legal control of the property. He sounded so cold, so terrifyingly pragmatic. The son I raised to be an honorable man was sitting on my patio, actively participating in a criminal conspiracy to steal my greatest asset. Then Brad chimed in, taking a long drag from his cigar. He leaned across the table and enthusiastically shifted the conversation to the money. He asked Jamal how fast they could get a massive home equity loan approved once the house was legally theirs. Brad practically salivated as he talked about how this stolen cash would finally fund his ridiculous failed tech startup. Chloe immediately jumped in, adding that a massive loan against my house would also cover the extensive renovations she wanted for the master suite, plus the new luxury vehicle she had been eyeing for months. They were not just stealing my home. They were going to mortgage it to the hilt, bleeding the equity dry to fund their delusions of grandeur and their designer lifestyles. I stood in the dark kitchen, my phone recording every single damning word. But the absolute worst, Yomsid, was yet to come. Brad chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, and looked toward the dark windows of my house. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a plume of smoke, and said the words that will echo in my mind for the rest of my life. Once the loan clears, we will toss the old lady into that cheap state-run facility downtown. She is going senile anyway. Hearing those words, hearing them casually plan to lock me away in a dismal, underfunded state facility just to get me out of the way, felt like a physical blow to my chest. I expected to collapse. I expected my knees to give out under the crushing weight of a mother's ultimate betrayal. For a fraction of a second, my heart shattered into a million jagged pieces. The immense grief of realizing that my only child was willing to throw me away like garbage for a financial payout threatened to suffocate me. But then right there in the shadows of my own kitchen, the grief completely stopped. The tears dried up before they could even form. The profound sorrow instantly morphed into something else entirely. It transformed into a pure, icy, terrifying rage. In the hospital, when you find a malignant tumor, you do not sit around and cry over it. You cut it out. I did not burst through the patio doors. I did not scream or demand answers. A foolish woman throws a tantrum, but a smart black woman builds an ironclad case. I quietly pressed the stop button on my phone, saving the audio file that held their entire criminal confession. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and retreated up the stairs, my steps completely silent and deliberate. I walked back into my bedroom and locked the door behind me. I was no longer a grieving mother. I was a strategist going to war, and I was going to burn their entire fraudulent world to the ground. The next morning dawned with a bright, cheerful sunlight that felt entirely out of place for the dark reality festering inside my home. I woke up at exactly 5 a.m, my mind as sharp and clear as a surgeon's scalpel. I showered, dressed in my usual comfortable clothes, and marched down to the kitchen to begin my performance. I brewed a fresh pot of premium coffee, fried up a skillet of thick-cut bacon, and prepared a stack of golden pancakes. When Jamal, Chloe, and Brad finally dragged themselves downstairs, just before 9, they found me standing at the stove, humming a cheerful gospel hymn. I greeted them with a wide, bright smile, pouring their coffee and sliding plates of hot food in front of them. I watched Chloe roll her eyes at my cheerfulness, whispering something under her breath to Brad, who simply grunted as he shoved a handful of bacon into his mouth. Jamal did not even look me in the eye as he thanked me for the meal. I stood there wiping down the countertops, listening to them discuss their plans for the day with sickening casualness. Chloe was going to a spa for a facial. Brad had some very important business meetings for his non-existent startup, and Jamal was heading to the office. They were so incredibly confident in their deception. They truly believed I was just a naive, fading old woman entirely at their mercy. I kept that bright, vacant smile plastered on my face until they all walked out the front door. The moment the deadbolt clicked shut, my smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unyielding resolve. I did not waste a single second. I went straight up to my bedroom, changed into a sharp, tailored navy blue suit that I used to wear to board meetings, and gathered my purse. My first and only destination was the downtown office of Mr. Harmon. He was a brilliant, fiercely loyal estate attorney who had helped my late husband and me draft our wills and manage our investments over a decade ago. When I walked into his immaculate mahogany office, he greeted me with genuine warmth. But his smile faltered the moment he saw the cold, hard set of my jaw. I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk, placed my smartphone between us, and pressed play. I made him listen to the entire audio recording I had captured on my patio the night before. I watched the color completely drain from Mr. Harmon's face as he listened to my son and my daughter-in-law casually plot to steal my home, drain its equity, and abandon me in a state-run facility. When the recording finished, the silence in the office was deafening. Mr. Harmon was absolutely furious. His hands were shaking with rage. Without waiting for my permission, he immediately logged into his computer and accessed the county clerk database to check the status of my property. What he found made my blood boil all over again. Chloe and Jamal had already attempted to file the forged quitclaim deed and a fraudulent lease-to-own agreement. The paperwork was sitting in a pending queue waiting for final processing. They had actually forged my signature, mimicking my handwriting with chilling accuracy, attempting to legally erase 4 decades of my hard work with the stroke of a stolen pen. Mr. Harmon immediately reached for his desk phone, his voice shaking with anger as he told me he was calling the police right this second to have them all arrested for felony fraud and elder abuse. But I reached across the desk and firmly placed my hand over his. I stopped him. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that calling the police right now was too easy. Sending them to jail before they fully understood the magnitude of their failure was a mercy they simply did not deserve. I spent decades running a hospital, I explained to him. When you find a deadly infection, you do not just put a bandage over it. You do the blood work, you map out the entire disease, and then you obliterate it completely so it can never return. I wanted their punishment to be absolute, public, and utterly inescapable. Mr. Harmon slowly put the phone down, seeing the terrifying determination burning in my eyes. He nodded, entirely on board with my method. I told him I needed a private investigator, someone discreet, fast, and ruthless. By that afternoon, Mr. Harmon had connected me with a former detective who specialized in financial forensics. I paid him a generous retainer from my hidden accounts and gave him a single directive. I wanted every dirty, hidden secret belonging to Chloe and Brad. The investigator did not disappoint. Within 48 hours, he handed me a dossier thicker than a medical textbook. The contents were absolutely staggering. Brad was not just a lazy opportunist, he was a professional parasite. His so-called tech startup was a complete fabrication, a front he used to solicit loans he never intended to repay. He had a trail of unpaid debts, defaulted credit cards, and 2 previous evictions across 3 different states. Chloe was no better. Her entire luxury lifestyle was funded by a mountain of secret, suffocating debt. She had maxed out several credit cards in Jamal's name without his knowledge, and she had a history of running similar financial grifts on ex-boyfriends before she targeted my naive son. They were drowning in a financial abyss of their own making, and my beautiful home was their final desperate lifeboat. They needed my equity to save themselves from total ruin. As I sat in my quiet office, flipping through the pages of their miserable, fraudulent lives, the final pieces of my master plan snapped perfectly into place. They thought they were the predators, and I was the prey. They had no idea they had just walked willingly into a trap from which they would never, ever recover. I sat across the polished mahogany desk from Mr. Harmon, the weight of a mother's ultimate heartbreak sitting heavily in my chest. But my mind was operating with the cold, ruthless precision of a military general. I instructed him to immediately draw up the paperwork for an irrevocable living trust. I was not going to leave a single crack in my armor for those vultures to exploit. By transferring the true legal deed of my home directly into an ironclad trust, I was effectively making myself a tenant of my own estate legally and permanently removing the property from my personal name. Mr. Harmon smiled a sharp, predatory smile as he stamped and notarized the heavy stack of documents. This brilliant legal maneuver meant that the fraudulent quitclaim deed Chloe and Jamal were desperately trying to push through the county clerk office was instantly rendered completely useless. It was legally null and void before the ink was even dry on their forgery. You simply cannot steal a house from someone who technically no longer owns it. I decided to let them submit their forged garbage. I would gladly let them commit a documented federal felony on public record. I had just built a bulletproof vault around the legacy my late husband and I had bled to build. With my real estate fortified and safe from their grasping hands, I turned my attention to the physical treasures left scattered throughout the house. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that the moment their fraudulent home equity loan fell through their smug arrogance would rapidly disintegrate into desperate, destructive rage. I could not risk losing the irreplaceable pieces of my family history to their petty vengeance. The next morning, the very moment Brad slithered out to meet his non-existent business partners, and Jamal and Chloe drove off to work, I moved swiftly and purposefully. I gathered my mother's delicate pearl necklaces, my husband's vintage gold watches, and the diamond anniversary earrings he had saved for 3 long years to buy me. I took the original birth certificates, the real property deeds, my marriage license, and a collection of antique silver coins my grandfather had passed down to me. I carefully wrapped each precious piece in velvet, placing them securely into a heavy canvas tote bag. I drove straight to my bank downtown and locked every single item safely away inside a heavy steel safe deposit box. Walking out of that bank vault and stepping back into the warm Atlanta sunlight, I felt a massive, suffocating weight lift from my shoulders. My history was untouchable. They could burn the house to the ground in their impending fury, but my legacy was utterly secure. Defending my assets was only half of the battle. I needed airtight, undeniable proof of their hostility, their trespassing, and their criminal intent to destroy my life. I contacted a highly recommended security firm that specialized in covert surveillance for high-net-worth clients. I paid them a premium cash fee to come to the house, while my ungrateful tenants were out enjoying a Friday night movie funded by my stolen money. Within 2 hours, the technicians had installed state-of-the-art hidden cameras disguised as perfectly ordinary household objects. A sleek smoke detector in the upstairs hallway, a digital clock resting innocently on the living room mantel, and an elegant air freshener sitting on the console table directly outside my home office door. Every corner of the common areas was thoroughly covered. The cameras recorded crystal clear, high-definition video and captured pristine, highly sensitive audio, streaming everything directly to a secure application hidden on my smartphone. I could now watch their every miserable move from anywhere in the world. I was turning my own home into a beautifully baited trap, and they were walking right into the center of the crosshairs without a single clue, with the trap perfectly set and primed. All I had to do was wait and play my part. I leaned into the role of the fading, exhausted old woman with an Oscar-winning dedication. I let Chloe parade around my kitchen, tossing her designer shopping bags onto my pristine countertops, while she complained loudly about the smell of my cooking. I let Brad leave his filthy piety, mud-caked boots on my expensive Persian rugs, and drink my expensive wine straight from the bottle. I let Jamal look right through me with his cowardly, guilty eyes as he rushed up the stairs to hide in his bedroom, avoiding the mother he was actively trying to destroy. I served them dinner with trembling hands. I smiled a frail, wobbly smile when they insulted me. I asked them to repeat themselves constantly, pretending my hearing was starting to fail and my mind was clouded with confusion. I watched them exchange those arrogant, victorious smirks across my dining table every single evening. They were so incredibly drunk on their own perceived brilliance. They truly believed their forged paperwork was sailing smoothly through the county channels. They thought they were mere days away from cashing a massive home equity check and tossing me into a state-run nightmare where I would be forgotten. But every time Chloe rolled her eyes, every time Jamal looked away in shame, and every time Brad muttered a highly disrespectful insult under his breath, my hidden cameras were silently recording it all. They thought they were burying me beneath their lies and their greed. They did not realize that I was the one holding the shovel, and I was digging a grave wide enough for all three of them. The inevitable collision finally arrived exactly as I had anticipated. I came home at 2 a.m, bone-tired after spending the evening comforting my sick sister. The house was completely dark and entirely silent. I climbed the curved wooden staircase, my hand trailing along the mahogany banister that I had polished and cared for over 2 decades. I walked down the hall to my master bedroom, craving nothing more than the quiet comfort of my own bed. I slid my key into the brass lock, but it refused to turn. The deadbolt had been engaged from the inside. For a moment I stood there in the dimly lit hallway, staring at the heavy wooden door in sheer disbelief. I knocked firmly. I waited. I knocked again, louder this time. Finally, the lock clicked and the door swung open just a few inches. Chloe stood right in the doorway, physically blocking my entrance. She was wrapped tightly in my expensive custom silk robe, the very same robe my late husband had bought for me during our anniversary trip to Paris. But it was not the stolen clothing that caught my attention. It was the crisp, white document she was waving back and forth in her manicured hand. It was the forged deed. She looked me right in the eye, her lips curling into a deeply arrogant, triumphant smirk. Her voice dripped with pure poison as she whispered that things were going to change around here from now on. She told me to look closely at the paper she was holding. She proudly announced that I was officially a tenant in her house now. The deed was done, she claimed, and the property belonged entirely to her and Jamal. She casually flipped her hair over her shoulder and delivered her final verdict. Brad was officially taking over the guest room permanently, which meant I no longer had a space on the second floor. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the staircase and told me I could go sleep on the lumpy couch downstairs. And if I did not like my new living arrangements, she added with a cruel giggle, the front door was right there. I slowly shifted my gaze away from her gloating face and looked further down the hallway. Brad was standing a few feet away, leaning casually against the floral wallpaper with his arms crossed over his chest. He let out a low, mocking chuckle, grinning at me with absolute contempt, clearly enjoying the sick spectacle of an older woman being thrown out of her own sanctuary. Then I looked inside the bedroom. Jamal, my only son, the boy I had literally broken my back to raise, protect, and educate, was sitting on the edge of my mattress. He was staring intensely at the floorboards, his shoulders hunched in complete cowardice. He entirely refused to meet his mother's eyes, while his wife attempted to steal my home right out from under me. They stood there waiting for my breakdown. They fully expected me to scream. They expected me to fall to my knees, beg for mercy, and cry out in sheer devastation at their cruel betrayal. But I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice in anger. Instead, a sound began to build deep inside my chest. It bubbled up through my throat and escaped my lips as a low chuckle. Within seconds, that chuckle grew into a deep, resonant, full-bodied laugh. My laughter echoed loudly against the hallway walls, booming with genuine, unrestrained amusement. I laughed until my eyes watered. I laughed because the sheer stupidity of these three parasites was absolutely breathtaking. The smug satisfaction completely melted off Chloe's face, replaced by a sudden nervous confusion. Brad stopped chuckling and stood up straight, his arrogant grin faltering. Jamal finally looked up from the floor, his eyes wide with a creeping sense of terror. My laughter was not the reaction of a defeated, broken victim. It was the terrifying sound of a woman who had just watched her enemies lock themselves happily inside a burning building. I slowly wiped a tear of pure amusement from my eye and reached into my purse. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. I did not call a friend. I did not call a relative for emotional support. I called the direct personal cell phone of the local precinct chief, Marcus Vance. Years ago, when Marcus was just a young patrol officer, he was brought into my hospital emergency room with a severe gunshot wound. I had personally coordinated his surgical teams, moved absolute mountains to get him the best trauma care in the state, and sat with his terrified wife in the waiting room until he was stable. He had never forgotten what I did for his family. When he answered on the second ring, I spoke in a crisp, authoritative tone. I told him I had a serious situation at my property involving felony fraud and trespassing, and I needed him and his officers here immediately. Within 10 minutes, the quiet suburban night was shattered by the aggressive screech of heavy tires. Flashing red and blue police lights painted the walls of my hallway through the front windows. 2 police cruisers, parked aggressively on my manicured lawn, followed immediately by the sleek black sedan of my estate attorney, Mr. Harmon. I calmly walked down the stairs and opened the front door, letting the officers and my lawyer into the foyer. Chloe and Brad hurried down the stairs right behind me, with Jamal trailing behind them like a frightened, guilty child. Chloe instantly tried to play the victim, her voice trembling artificially as she asked the officers why they were here. She clutched the forged deed to her chest and loudly claimed that this was her property and I was causing a disturbance. I did not say a word to her. I simply stepped aside and let Mr. Harmon step forward. He opened his leather briefcase and handed a thick, legally bound document to the lead officer. He announced in a booming professional voice that the paper Chloe was holding was a fraudulent, useless document. He presented the ironclad, irrevocable living trust, proving unequivocally that I was not the legal owner of the house, but merely a tenant of the trust. This made it completely impossible for me to sign the house over to anyone, let alone my deceitful daughter-in-law. He then pulled out the thick dossier from the private investigator, along with my pristine audio recordings, detailing their exact plot to commit wire fraud, forge a legal property deed, and illegally secure a massive home equity loan. The lead officer turned to Chloe and Jamal, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. He informed them with a stern, unforgiving voice that forging a property deed and attempting to defraud a financial institution were severe federal felonies carrying heavy prison sentences. The remaining color instantly drained from Chloe's face. Her knees visibly buckled, and she dropped the forged paper onto the floor as if it had suddenly caught fire. Jamal began to shake violently, stammering and begging the officers to listen to him, crying out that it was all a terrible mistake, and he never meant to hurt anyone. The trap had slammed shut, and its steel teeth were buried deep in their arrogant bones. I turned my attention to Brad, who was standing frozen on the bottom step in his plaid pajamas. I pointed my finger directly at his chest and looked the officers dead in the eye. I stated clearly and loudly that I had never invited this lazy man into my home, that he had no legal right to reside here, and that he was actively trespassing on my private property. The officers did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. Two of them marched right up to Brad, grabbed him roughly by the arms, and forcefully dragged him toward the front door. He kicked and cursed, screaming my name in absolute humiliation as he was hauled across my front lawn in his pajamas. He was paraded in front of every single neighbor who had stepped out onto their porches in the middle of the night to watch the flashing police lights. With the house finally purged of that loud parasite, I turned to face my son and the woman who had tried to destroy me. They were backed up against the staircase, weeping and shaking, finally realizing their entire lives were currently resting in the palm of my hand. I looked at Jamal, feeling the last remaining thread of my maternal affection turn completely to cold ash. I spoke with a voice as cold and merciless as a winter storm. I told them they had exactly 15 minutes to pack one single bag of their belongings under the strict supervision of these police officers. I told them that once those 15 minutes were up, they would walk out my front door and they would never return to this neighborhood. Jamal fell to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably, begging me to remember that he was my only son. I looked down at him without a single ounce of pity. I told him that my son died the moment he sat on my bed and let a stranger steal my home. I told them to pack their bags and get out, because from this second forward they were completely and permanently dead to me. 3 months have passed since that chaotic night, and the silence in my sprawling 4-bedroom home is absolutely beautiful. The legal system moved with a swiftness that left them spinning, and the consequences for my former family were merciless. Jamal and Chloe are currently facing severe felony charges for wire fraud and forgery. Without my roof over their heads or my retirement account to drain, they are absolutely drowning in mounting legal fees. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that they are currently renting a tiny roach-infested studio apartment on the bad side of town, desperately struggling to scrape together enough money just to keep the lights on. The luxury designer lifestyle Chloe tried to fund with my blood and sweat has completely vanished. Brad did not escape unscathed either. He was completely cut off by his sister, mostly because she had nothing left to give him, and he is now facing his own serious legal battles for being an accessory to their fraudulent plot. As for me, I have entirely redecorated my master bedroom. The old layout is gone, replaced with bright, vibrant colours and luxurious linens that reflect my new lease on life. My precious family photos are back on the hallway walls, framed and honoured exactly where they belong. Every single morning I wake up early, brew a fresh pot of premium coffee, and sit out on my back patio. I watch the sun rise over my garden, surrounded by my beloved blooming flowers. I am financially secure, completely unburdened, and finally living my golden years in absolute uninterrupted peace. The heavy, suffocating weight of an ungrateful son has been lifted from my shoulders, and the air has never tasted sweeter. This entire harrowing ordeal taught me a profound lesson that I will carry for the rest of my days. True family is not determined by blood. It is determined by respect. I learned the hard way that you can give someone the entire world, and they will still try to steal the sky. I sacrificed my youth and my body to give my son a perfect debt-free start in life, and his response was to try and legally erase me. But you must never mistake a mother's silent grace for weakness. Because when a strong black woman has finally had enough, she does not just get mad, she gets smart. Did you enjoy my story? What would you have done if your own flesh and blood tried to steal your home right out from under you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is right now. See you in the next life story. Stay blessed and stay fierce.